All right, well, it is 11 o'clock, so we will get started. Thank you all for attending this morning. My name is Catherine. I'm one of the adult librarians at the Chelsea District Library, and we're proud to host Keegan Rodgers from the Lakehouse Bakery. He has done a number of programs with us that have been very successful, including our Desserts by Decades series. And today he's going to talk about the basics of bread making. And so with that, I will let him have the floor.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thanks to the Chelsea Library for having me. I love doing this and talking about food, my favorite subject on the planet, because it's food. I love food. Love everything about it. So today we're here to talk about bread, artisan bread basics. There's a lot of information here. So there's a chat for questions. So if you have one, please send a message over for a chat and we'll answer the questions at the end of the presentation. And they're going to record this and have it posted. So if you miss something, it'll be available for a while for you to kind of go back through and review. So let's just dive in right now. So, hang on, there we go. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what makes bread artisan. What exactly does that mean? We're going to do a little bit of math today. I know it's early on a Saturday and your brains might not be ready for some math, but it's not terrible, so it'll be all right. We're going to talk about the bread making process and what that looks like and break down the stages. And there's a lot happening there. The ingredients, we'll talk about each one of the 4 ingredients that goes into artisan breads. What exactly is gluten and how to control it, because that is the crucial point to making bread. Some equipment you might need and some resources some books you can check out from the library. So you can kind of build on this information. All right, so what makes bread artisan? What is it what is artisan and how does it become bread? What exactly does that mean? So artisan defined is a skilled trade, one that involves making things by hand. So for you at home, that's fairly easy to do with 1 or 2 loaves of bread. You can make it by hand. For us here at the bakery, we do use machines, we use mixers, but we do it in a traditional way with high quality ingredients. So that's what makes our bread artisan. Most of the things that we do are by hand. The only thing we don't do by hand is, of course, the mixing in the big mixers. So that's what makes something artisan. We are a skilled trade making bread. And bread is a food made of flour, water, and yeast or other leavening agent mixed together and baked. Fairly straightforward, fairly simple. But bread is one of those things that there's hundreds of kinds of breads. I honestly lost track, about 375. There's that many types of breads. Every culture has their signature bread. Some countries have a signature bread. Think the French baguette. America has white bread, don't mean like Wonder, but like a farmhouse white bread. So there's all kinds of breads from all over the world, and they all have the same basic properties involved with them. And we'll kind of go through those today. All right, so let's dive into the bakery math. Bakers use something called baker's percentage. And basically what that does is it allows us to compare formulas easily, and it also lets us really easily scale the formulas. So a bread formula, we can increase the size, we can decrease the size much easier using baker's math than we could just getting out a calculator and using that. The key component to baker's math is that the flour is always represented as 100%. So that means that there's something more than flour in the bread. There's other items. And so your total would be more than 100%. If you're using more than one type of flour, let's say rye flour and wheat flour, the 2 flours combined equal 100%. So if it's 60-40, 50-50, 70-30, 80-20, as long as that total is 100. And it really, once you've got that number, it's fairly easy to figure out the rest. And knowing that all the other ingredients are in relation to the flour also helps. So this slide, I think, really helps break down the baker's math so it's easier to see. So don't think of it like the pie, all right? We're not making pie. I love pie, but we're not making pie today. Think of it as a bar chart. We've got flour at 100%, and then the water, salt, yeast, and you can see how that translates. So basically, if you look at the math on this, you pick the amount of flour, and it could be anything, as long just remembering that the flour is 100%. It could be 500 grams, it could be 5,000 grams, it could be 555 grams. It doesn't matter. It could be anything. The other ingredients will be calculated based on that amount. So for this example, 500 grams of flour, we need 70% of that weight in water. That gets us 350 grams of water. 2% of salt gets us 10 grams, and 1% yeast gets us 5 grams. That's all baker's percentage is. It's the other ingredients calculated in relation to the formula. So if I change the 500 grams to say 5,000 grams, I can still easily convert the other ingredients in the recipe to match so that the formula stays the same, that the ratios stay the same. And that's the crucial part to this. So we're not going to talk too much more about the baker's math today. I just wanted you to see this because as we're going through the presentation today, you'll see some percentages, and I want you to kind of connect these dots together. So that's the baker's math. All right, so let's dive into baking. There's a lot happening when we start yeast baking. And yeast baking is primarily just bread. There's a couple of quick breads, muffins, or cookies that use yeast, but very, very few. So this is primarily talking about bread. All right, so first we have to scale the ingredients. And we scale them by weight. You'll notice in the baker's math slide beforehand, things were expressed in grams. Grams are the most accurate way to scale and weigh ingredients. Ounces, of course, are the next accurate. Volume measures, like a cup, is typically not used for commercial bread baking. And honestly, for at home, it really would be better to use a scale, a digital scale, to weigh the ingredients, so you'll be more successful. Scaling is crucial to make sure you've got the ratios right so that you'll get that much more success going forward. Once you've got the ingredients scaled, then you'll need to mix them. You'll distribute the ingredients, you'll create a dough, and you'll develop gluten. We're going to talk about gluten a little bit later on, but bear that in mind when we're talking about mixing, that's really the point to bread is the gluten and how much or how little we want in the bread. Once it's mixed, we ferment the dough. We do this a couple times through the process. This first one is usually called the bulk fermentation. It develops the flavor of the bread. It also helps the gluten become really elastic. And that's what we want, is some fairly elastic gluten so that as it rises in the oven and ferments, that we get flavor and texture. And that's really what we need from the gluten. Next, we've got folding. So once it's fermented, sometimes some old school recipes will say to punch down the dough in the bowl that you've fermented it in. That's the same thing. We're redistributing the ingredients. We're giving the gluten a chance to relax. We're letting the gases escape. And we're also making sure that the dough is the same temperature. If part of the dough is warmer or colder than the other, then it won't turn out as well in the oven. So we need to make sure that they're the same temperature. Then we're going to scale it into the size loaves that we need. So for you at home, you might be making 1 or 2 loaves. For us here, when we're doing 15 or 20 at a time, it's a little bit different. So we need to scale them to the size of bread that we're looking for. After that, we're going to create the pre-shape. So, excuse me. If we want something like a baguette long, we'll shape it into a little bit long section. If we want something round, then we'll pre-shape it round. If it's going into a loaf pan, we'll kind of create like a bigger torpedo almost. And then once it's doing that, we'll let it bench rest. This relaxes the gluten, some yeast expands a little bit, and we get some proofing on it. But we really want to relax the gluten. We don't want to overwork it. That makes the bread really tough. Once it's bench rested, we give it its final shape. So again, for a baguette, I mean, we might start this big, but it'll end up really nice and long and thin. Same for even the round. It might get just a little bit bigger. And if it goes into a pan, this is when we would put it into the bread pan so that it will go through the proofing, the final fermenting process to get its final shape. This is what it's going to look like when it goes in the oven. The yeast is going to expand, and we're going to have the nice, beautiful loaf of bread that we see right before it goes in the oven. At this point, there's like a 9.5. We could score the bread. So I'll talk about that in a minute, but that's like cutting it to create a design on the bread. So in some, you've seen really beautiful designs in the top. They use a scoring knife to do that. So that's kind of like 9.5. 10 is the actual baking. We'll talk about that in a second because there's a lot happening in the oven. And then once it's baked, we'll bring it out and let it cool. It has to cool completely before being bagged or being sliced. If it's not completely cool, then it will form moisture inside the bag. If you try to slice bread before it's completely cool, you'll end up creating a gummy mess. It's not very tasty, and it sticks to the knife, and it's not very good. So we need to let it cool completely. And then we need to store it however we're going to store it. Plastic bags, paper bags, however you're storing it. The best way to do it, of course, is in a plastic bag to prevent staling. Depending on the type of bread you have or you're making, the shelf life on it could be as short as 6 hours, or it could be as long as 4 days. It just depends. In any chance you can to prevent the bread from going stale, the better. And that's, storing it in moisture-proof bags. All right, so I know this seems like a lot. We're kind of talking about the whole baking process, but we'll get into to bread in a second, just to give you some references on what's going on. So baking it. This 7 stages of baking happens for everything, whether it's bread, a cookie, a muffin, which it's National Muffin Day today, by the way. So, and hopefully you'll come by and enjoy a muffin. But all these 7 things happen for everything that's baked. So you put something in the oven, and the formation and expansion of CO2, carbon dioxide. That's where the oven spring or the lift comes in. You put bread in the oven and you'll start to see it rise. That's what's happening there. Once that starts to rise, those air pockets get trapped and they stay there. Things are starting to solidify, and they're staying in as after they lift. They won't collapse down, hopefully. Starches gelatinize and become firm at 140 degrees, so it's fairly toasty in there. And that's again, so we've got the oven spring, it comes up, and then it starts to set, so it stays there and doesn't collapse down. Proteins coagulate at 165, and there's some protein in this bread, and I'll talk about what those are in a second. Water evaporates at 210, because that's when water boils. So the moisture in it evaporates out and becomes steam. Any fat, so if you've got butter or oil, olive oil, like say you're making a naan, you've got olive oil in there, they melt and release any trapped gases. So you might get a little bit more bump on shape on that. And then finally, the crust forms and it gets nice and golden brown, that color that we know and love for bread. So again, there's a lot happening in a fairly short period of time in your oven. For us, it's about 30 to 40 minutes because we keep our oven fairly high, right at 450 here at the bakery. All right, so you've got your formula, you're ready to make some bread, and there's a couple ways that you can do that. So the easiest way is the straight dough method. Everything just goes into the mixing bowl and it turns on and it mixes until the dough is fully developed. And there's the modified straight dough method. Typically, this is used for other things than bread. There's a couple breads that you could make with this. English muffins are made this way, but for the most part, it's other things like muffins, cookies, other brioche, or my brain just went blank on croissants. That's the other one, croissants. So there's a couple other ways to make it. Sponge method or pre-ferment, and we're going to talk a lot about these here in a little bit. We dissolve the yeast in liquid with flour, could be water, could be milk, and we make it into a soft, thick, sticky batter or dough. We ferment until doubled. We add the sponge to the rest of the ingredients, and then we mix until it becomes the bread dough that we want. This is what makes most bread today artisan, is using this sponge method. And there's a variety of pre-ferments and a variety of sponges, and we're going to talk about what those are in a second. So some advantages to using it rather than the straight dough method is we shorten the fermentation time, so that it shortens the whole process down to a little bit. Instead of maybe 6 or 7 hours, it's down to about 4. It also here for us, maybe not for you at home, but when we're doing 7 doughs at once, 7 different breads at once, this gives us a little bit of flexibility so that we can do them all in the same time and get them in and out of the oven quicker. For me, the biggest reason to use a sponge in a pre-ferment is, of course, the improved flavor. We'll talk about that in a second with some of the other pre-ferments, but that's really where the flavor is developed. A rich dough is one that has fat in it, butter, olive oil, something along those lines. And it gives by doing the pre-ferment, it gives those doughs a richer, stronger fermentation on it. And it, again, adds to the flavor. By fermenting it, we're letting the yeast do its thing a bit more. So we don't need as much yeast. And then leavening, which is the same thing. I mean, that's why we're doing it, is to get lift and get leavening, to get the texture of the bread that we want. And then the structure. So if you think about bread, there's basically only 4 ingredients, and we'll talk about those 4 ingredients in a second. But the difference between a baguette and our farmhouse white is huge, but they're the same basic 4 ingredients. So using a sponge or a pre-ferment will change the structure of the bread that we're making to make different kinds of bread. Remember, I mentioned those 300 and some odd different types of bread. This is one of the ways we do it, is by using a different sponge or pre-ferment. Now we've got a couple different types that we could pick from. Depending on the type of bread we want to make, we would use a different sponge or pre-ferment. So a pate fermentee, a poulish, a biga, a sour starter, a sponge, or a levain. These are the basic pre-ferments and sponges that you can use for bread. And again, depending on the bread you want to make will depend on which of these that you use. So let's talk about these for a second. A pate fermentee is a mixture of flour, salt, water, and yeast. Pretty basic. That's the ingredients in all bread. They're mixed and left to ferment, usually overnight, 4 to 6 hours, sometimes 8, depending on how long you want to go. You could take dough from the batch that you made today and use it to do your pate fermentee for tomorrow. And if you look at the bottom, the basic formula, see there are those percentages I mentioned. It has less water than flour. Not a lot less, but less. And these are used for sourdoughs, baguettes, or a fougasse. And that's the one that's kind of large, that looks like a ladder, that has cuts in it, usually topped. And you'd use a pate fermentee for these breads. And if you look, the basic formula, bread flour 100%, water 65%, salt 1.9, and yeast 0.55. So not a lot of yeast at all. Yeah, that's all I can think of on that one. All right, so next we have a poulish. It's a wet sponge. It's very wet. And if you look at the formula at the bottom of the screen, it's equal flour and water. They're typically made fresh for each batch of bread with a fermentation time of up to 18 hours. You wouldn't want to go too much longer than that, or it would exhaust itself. You could go as less as 15 hours, but typically, 15 to 18 hours is pretty standard. It's good for pita, also baguette, and very, very crusty, crunchy breads that have a really firm crust and a firm structure. 100% bread flour, 100% water, and then just a little bit of yeast, not much at all, is for the poolish. Next, we've got the biga. It's an Italian version of the pate fermenti, but there's no salt in it. So because there's no salt in it, we don't need as much yeast. Ferment for also 15 to 18 hours. And this is really good for ciabatta. If you like a nice ciabatta, this is where the flavor comes in. We do an 18-hour ferment on our ciabatta here, which we don't normally make because it does take so long to. And the shelf life is like 2 hours. Focaccia and any other Italian breads, because it's the Italian version of the pate fermenti. But look at the difference in water. There's a bit more water in this than there was the pate fermenti, and not as much yeast. So again, 100% flour, 66 water, and then 0.49 on the yeast. Next, we've got a sourdough starter. This is what typically, for a while there was a thing that you would get like a starter in a jar, would add flour and stuff in it, and then your friendship bread. This is typically what those would do, is create the starter for sourdough. Traditionally, wild yeast is used, and I'll talk about wild yeast here in a little bit. For us, we usually use commercial yeast. I have made a starter with wild yeast before, and it was an amazing flavor, which was kind of cool. The bacteria from the yeast, since it's wild, creates acid, and that lowers the pH on the bread, which gives it the more sour flavor, and that's what we love about sourdough. And there's a couple different sour starters: white, light or dark rye, and then wheat. So depending on the type of sourdough you want to make, you would use one of these 3 starters. Basic formula for those are pretty much the same. Is the flour at 100%, water at 75, yeast at 5%, so it's got a fair amount of yeast. And then the wheat sour is the same, but you've got bread flour and wheat flour. Now the difference is with the light and dark rye, the rye is injected in, so it's bread flour and light rye, or bread flour and dark rye, as long as those two equal 100%. And then it's the same basic formula. If you notice, the bread flour and wheat flour added up to 100%. Next, we've got a sponge. So this isn't your traditional pre-ferment. It's a much, much shorter fermentation time, 30 minutes to an hour and a half. It gets really big bubbles, really pronounced smell. The sour smell is really awesome on it, but it's used immediately in the bread that you're making. So you make a sponge specifically for that bread. And typically the formula will tell you the amounts to use, and then so that you'll follow up with the rest of the ingredients that go in the sponge to make the final bread. Good for baguette, bagels, and Baileys. And it's 100% 60 water and then 1% yeast. So again, not much yeast at all on the sponge. The 30 to 90 minute ferment is really where you get the action and the lift on that one. A levain is a French sour starter. It produces lactic and acetic acids, which produce the sour flavor and the tang. And the process to make your own starter can be about 70 to 72 hours. It's really simple to do. And once you've mastered the way to make this and keep it alive, it can stay alive forever. It is alive, and it does require some care. And I'll talk about that in a second. I know of a restaurant in Ann Arbor that has a levain that's over 120 years old. So it absolutely can last as long as it's taken care of. So to make your own levain or sour starter, you need a tall container with an airtight lid. You mix the ingredients in it, and you scrape them down to the bottom. and you let it stand on the counter covered for 24 hours. Equal parts flour, water, and we'll talk about wild yeast again in a second. Whatever the yeast is on, you'll need some of that. Or if you're using commercial yeast, just a little bit. So like not even a full packet that you get at the grocery store, the little packets of yeast, like not even a full one of those. So that's day one. Day two, so you should notice, that's why you need a tall container. You should notice that if it was to here, then the next day it might be to here. So it should have increased in size, and you need the headroom to allow for that growth. It'll have a musty smell to it. You should have tiny bubbles. And then you'll add equal parts flour and water, and then mix that together. And you let it covered with the lid and sit out for another 24 hours. On day three, do the same thing. The smell will be considerably more pronounced. There will be bubbles all the way through it, not just on the top. And you'll notice that there's some sticky kind of gummy strands throughout it as you're mixing. That's exactly what you want to see. That's the gluten developing, and you really want to see that. You can use it at that point, and you can, once you do the same, after that, after this day, the third day, when you add equal parts flour, water, then it's usable. So it's on the fourth day that it's usable. To maintain it, just keep adding flour and water. So you'll have your chef, then you'll add 50% of flour and then 150% water and mix it. If you're going to use it right away, just mix it and then use it. If you're not going to use it right away, it should go in your refrigerator. So if you're making bread once a week, it should go in the refrigerator someplace really cool, and that will put the whole thing in hibernation, essentially. You don't want it to freeze, so don't put it outside right now. It's too cold. It will freeze, and then it'll ruin, and you'll have to start all over again. But otherwise, just pop it in the refrigerator. When you're ready to start mixing again, pull it out about an hour or two beforehand so it raises to room temperature, and then mix. Don't mix cold. That will exhaust the fermenting and the yeast that's in there. It won't be good for it. Every 7 days, you need to throw some away and then keep adding equal parts flour and water. And you do that so that it stays fresh. So it's almost like giving it a good stiff injection of protein, because that's what it is in the flour. But you're giving it you've let it rest, so now you got to give it some go juice, and that's what this is doing. So add the flour and water equal parts and mix. Now, when it's sitting in there, you might notice some brown liquid, just a thin layer of brown liquid on the top. That's fine. Leave it, just mix it in. It's okay. If that liquid is tinged pink at all, it's spoiled. It's gone rancid and needs to be thrown away. Bacteria, the wrong kind of bacteria has grown, and it needs to be completely thrown away, the cylinder washed and rinsed and sanitized, and then start again. It could make you quite sick. So if it's even the slightest tinge of pink, you want to be sure to throw it away. All right, hang on. Sorry about that. All right, so now we've got our starter. We've got our formula. Levain. Sorry about it. I forgot this one. Once it becomes our levain, we just mix it in with the rest of the formula. We do need to incorporate new oxygen. We need to, again, give it some go juice. It'll be really stiff. If you have a small KitchenAid mixer or something like that, that would be good to mix this in. It's okay. It won't hurt it. And let it sit for, quite a while, 8 to 10 hours on the counter, so that it has a chance to do what it needs to do. If it goes right back in the cooler, it'll be too cold and it won't ferment easily, and you'll lose some of that flavor. But after the 10 hours, pull it out with, again, getting it to room temperature, pull out what you need and for your formula, and then make your bread. So while you're making your bread, there's a step called autolyse. What this does is you combine the flour, water, and the pre-ferment, mix it, not thoroughly, but you mix it and let it sit for about 30 minutes, no more than 30 minutes. That lets a couple things happen. We're mixing gluten and we're getting some gluten development, and we want that, but we don't want to over mix it. So we're letting the gluten relax because there's nothing happening right now. So the gluten strands kind of tend to ball together, but what we want them to do is to just relax and be kind of cool. So letting it rest will do that. And it's only 30 minutes at most, 10 minutes at least. And then we'll add the salt and continue the mixing after that time frame. And that just increases the flavor, it increases the texture, and gets it really closer to whatever bread you're making that you want to. And you can auto-lees any kind of bread. It doesn't matter whether it's a baguette or if it's focaccia, it just doesn't matter. Ciabatta, you can auto-lees anything. Awesome. All right. So we talked about some ingredients. There's really only 4 in bread. Now, you can add other things, like our multigrain has flax and oats and rye, and a couple other things in it. But for bread, basically, it's 4 ingredients: flour, yeast, water, salt. So because it's only 4 ingredients, you've got to be really particular in the 4 ingredients that you pick. And we're going to talk about each one of those ingredients. We're going to start with flour because it's the single most important part of the whole process. There's 2 basic types of wheat kernels, hard and soft. We've heard about soft winter wheat or hard summer wheat. And the protein in the wheat will vary based on the version of kernel that you're using. It'll also matter on how it's milled, but we'll talk about that in a second. But all wheat flours contain gluten. And that's really what makes the bread, is the gluten. You don't have to memorize this or know this. This is just to kind of give you an idea of the types of flour. So the hard wheat flours, straight flour is made from 100% of the wheat kernel. It's the whole thing, the bran, the germ, all of it. It's used for breads and high gluten items. Think pizza dough. Then there's patent flour, which is milled from just the white of the wheat kernel. It's also called bread flour. Has a lot, it's the most extraction other than the 100%, so 60 to 95% of the wheat kernel. Then there's clear flour, which is funny to me because it's not clear, it's actually dark. It contains the endosperm, and it's used primarily in rye, mostly dark rye or pumpernickel breads. Then we've got high gluten flour, which is used in breads, pizzas, bagels, things that have a chewier texture that we want that extra protein in it. So the soft wheat flours are typically not used for bread. They're used for cakes and pastries. And as you can see, cake flour and pastry flour have very low or very weak protein contents. This is things like muffins, cakes, biscuits. So a couple other things, but really madeleines, sponge cakes, these are what the soft wheat flours would be used for because of the lower protein content. So this is the kinds of flours that are out there in the world, and look at the percentages. And again, you don't have to memorize this, or and it's never going to say this on the package, but you want to make sure you're using the right ingredient for what we're doing here. So you would not use cake flour to make bread. It won't work. And conversely, you wouldn't want to use bread flour to make a cake. So you want to use the right type of flour. Bread flour, high gluten flour, all purpose is okay. It's strong enough as long as it's paired with a bread flour or a higher percentage flour. Medium, dark and white rye flours are, fairly strong in their gluten content. But just again, this is just so you can see the comparison on the proteins in the flour so that you know why you're using the ingredient you're using. So yeast, let's talk about yeast for a second. It is alive. I always feel like a mad scientist whenever I make bread because I'm creating another life form from it. So just like other life forms, it needs a couple things to be taken care of. It needs to be treated with respect and nicely. So you want to feed it, you want to give it some water, you want to give it a place to party and do its thing. And that's what you're doing in the fermenting process is giving it that party to go to. For breads that you make at home, there is a specific bread machine yeast. Don't use that. It won't work. It's designed specifically for bread machines, but the little packets you get at the store of Fleshman's or Red Star, those will work great. That's exactly what you need. And those will work fine for your bread. But there's basically 4 types of yeast that you'll find available: active, dry, instant, fresh, which you'll probably never come across in a grocery store, and liquid. And you're like, liquid? I'll talk about that in a second. And then wild yeast. All right, so let's look at some of these. Active, dry, you have to dissolve in some warm liquid. Now, the liquid can be warm, but it can't be hot. Anything over 110 degrees, you'll kill the yeast. So it needs to be between 105 and 109 to get it activated. So it needs to be warm enough to get it awake. It's like its cup of coffee, but not so hot that it will scorch it and burn. And it literally, it's a 4-degree window. But if you've got your formula and it says to use instant, use instant. You can't use active dry. And reverse. So the instant doesn't require dissolving in liquid. It's also known as rapid rise because that's what it does. And it's not interchangeable with the active dry either. So for the active dry, let me step back for that for a second. You'll put it in let's say a container, and you'll have some water in it, and you'll add the yeast, and then the bubbles will froth and ferment up to the very top. That's what you want to see happen. If you're using your thermometer and you test your liquid and it's nice in the right spot and you add the yeast in and nothing happens, it was old yeast and it's dead. Typically, the packages of yeast, about 60% of the yeast in there is active. The other 40 is not. So just bear that in mind and keep an eye on those dates on the package so that you're using fresher yeast. Fresh yeast is actually fairly moist. It comes in a compressed cake, and that's generally only available for places like me, where it comes like 51-pound fresh cakes to a case. So you'll very rarely ever see that on the grocery store shelf. So liquid yeast is the sponge or the pre-ferment that you've created and worked with. That's what that is. That's why you do that, so that you're adding that yeast into your bread formula. You're making your own with those pre-ferments and sponges. That's why I went into those and talked about them, so that you know what's going on with your bread. And then we've got wild yeast. So wild yeast is everywhere. It's absolutely everywhere. It's typically concentrated on fruits and vegetables. And as you can see on the blueberries and the apple, it's that outer coating. You can kind of see on the apple where there's some that's been scraped away. That white kind of powdery coating is the yeast. So if you're going to use, let's say, the blueberries to make your starter, you'd add 8 or 10 ounces of the blueberries with the flour and water and let the yeast on the blueberries feed and drink on the water around it to start the process. Once you've got a good, like on the 3rd day, you've got a good size starter going, you can pull the blueberries out and just keep feeding the yeast from there, and it will continue on living. It won't taste like blueberries. It won't taste like apples. This is just a really cool way to find wild yeast and use that to create your starters. I've done this with blueberries. I've done it with cabbage. I've done it with, I haven't done it with apples yet, so I'll have to try that. But it was super simple and didn't require much energy at all. Just mixed it all together and followed that process to create my chef. And then there it was. And I called it berry because it was made with blueberries. Anyway, you see what I did there. All right, water. Water is it's absolutely crucial to bread. I talked about flour being the key component, and honestly, all four of them are the key component. And it's blank right now because I want you to think about the types of water that are available to you. We're very fortunate that we have all this water available. And the type of water you use for your bread really, really does matter. So we've got tap water, which goes through a filtration system and is typically fluoridated. We've got well water. We've got distilled water, filtered in reverse osmosis water, if you have that kind of filtration system on your home. We've got spring or artesian water. We've got deionized water. We've got hard water. We've got softened water. Phew. I need some water now that I've said all this. It really, really does matter. We have well water here at the bakery, which the bread loves because there's calcium and magnesium in the water. What it doesn't love is iron. So I do have an iron filter on the building so that the iron is filtered out. But just like us, we need calcium and magnesium for better health. So does the yeast. Using things like distilled or filtered, deionized water are a bad idea. It doesn't have the micronutrients that you need to make the bread as successfully. You could go to the store and buy a gallon of distilled water, and it is water. It will function, but it won't be as successful as you could be had you used something else. I avoid reverse osmosis water at all costs. There's nothing in it. It's actually considered dead water, which I found funny because it's water. It's life-giving. It's great for you, but not bread so much. Hard water is okay for bread because, again, it's got the micronutrients in it. But softened water, if you think about your water softening system, what do you put in your water softening system? Salt pellets, right? What does salt do to microorganisms? It kills it. So we did a test here. We don't have a water softening system here, but my neighbor does. So we borrowed some of her water and made some bread with it. And the difference was just noticeable. So the bread with just our well water rose fairly high. With the water made with her softened water was considerably lower. It still formed the bread, but it didn't look as full and it didn't rise as much because the salt that's inherently in the water killed the yeast, and it wasn't as successful in the fermenting process either. So the water really does matter. Tap water is fine, so don't worry if you've got to go out and buy a bunch of water. Tap water works great. Again, well water is generally going to be better for it than tap water. Salt. Kind of mentioned this a minute ago. Salt does kill yeast. So like, why am I putting salt in bread? Well, that's flavor as well. So, and it's one way to control the yeast and the gluten. We'll talk about that in a second. Non-iodized is the way to go. So anything that's got a small granule or a fine or a flake, sea salt, kosher salt, something along those lines is going to be a better bet for you. The iodizing process denatures the salt and it adds a really funky taste to it. So sea salt or kosher salt are the way to go for that one. All right, so we've talked a lot about gluten. Now, what the heck is it and how do we control it? So gluten is the protein that's developed when two other proteins get wet. So in flour is glutenin and gliadin, and when they get mixed with water and mixed, they create gluten. And the gluten, think of it as rubber bands. It will stretch and stretch and stretch and stretch and stretch, and eventually it will break. So you want to, work the gluten to the right point for the bread that you're making. Again, think a baguette versus something softer like a farmhouse bread. Controlling the gluten is what will give you the different types of bread. because they're all the same basic four ingredients. So how you mix it and the proportions you mix them in is what gives you the different types of bread. So there's four basic ways to control gluten. The flour you use, we talked about cake versus bread flour. Fat, butter, olive oil, canola oil, whatever, some other type of oil that will control or inhibit the gluten development. How we mix it, we've talked about that, whether it's the straight dough method or whether it's we're letting it bulk ferment for a longer period of time. That will absolutely affect the size and strength of the gluten. And then how much moisture is absorbed, the amount of liquid in the formula. The more moisture is absorbed, the more proteins the bonds are not as strong. They're weakened because there's so much water, and they won't form as long a chain that we want. And these really are the four ways to control it. So we've got there's a lot happening there. So with the gluten, we want to stretch it to the point that it gives us the texture we want, but we don't want to work it too much. If you've ever had a hockey puck biscuit, it's a biscuit you get and you kind of bang it on the counter and it's like a hockey puck. It's really tough and really chewy, and the gluten was overworked. The reverse of that, though, is if it's not worked enough, it'll break apart and fall. If you've picked up some bread and kind of tore open the bread and it crumbled in front of you, that was not working it enough. And that's why gluten is so crucial to bread, and what we do with it matters to get the bread that we want. So how do you know if you've got the gluten that you want? Well, this is one way to know. So the picture shows you the window pane test. So in some breads, typically rich breads like brioche, you can stretch it and stretch it and stretch it and stretch it and stretch it, and it will look like a window pane. You should be able to see through it. So depending on the type of bread you're making will depend on the type of gluten you're developing. But this is a really quick way to know how it's developed to the point that you need it or not. If it falls apart when you work it with your hands, it's not ready yet. If it holds together but tears when you check, it's not ready yet. And if it doesn't tear and holds a thin membrane, that's what you want. You want to be able to do that and see, and you can see in that picture how thin the bread is and how the dough is. It's fairly thin, and that's really what you want. That way the gluten is fully formed, it's holding in everything it needs to, but is still stretchy, that when it goes in the oven to bake, it will stretch and rise up to trap the gases to give us the lift that we want from the leavening and the yeast and the fermenting processes. All right, so there are some really basic pieces of equipment that you need for bread. Not too terribly exotic or extravagant, some pretty basic things. I do strongly recommend a scale. Digital, they're not that expensive, from Amazon or Sur La Table, Williams Sonoma. They're pretty available. I think you admire Target. It has them, of course, the Amazon. Digital is best for as large as you need for the bread that you're going to make. Then, of course, your oven. That's a fairly crucial thing. I talk about getting to know your oven at the hands-on classes here, and it's crucial that you get to know your oven. You know where the hot spots are. You know if the temperature gauge is accurate or not. Just because it says 350 on the dial does not mean that it's 350 in the oven. So that's pretty important to know about your oven. A mixing bowl and or stand mixer. The mixer with the beaters won't work. It doesn't do what we need to develop the gluten, so those won't work. Some of them do have like corkscrews. That should work, but really either a stand mixer or your hands is really the way to go with that. A proof box or area. Some of you might think about, like your grandma would say, to put the bowl on the stove covered towards the back where the heat is, or maybe on the refrigerator or somewhere where it's nice and warm, draft free. That warmth is going to let the yeast and the fermenting happen easier. So that's all that is. You could create a proof box which has heat and moisture in it, but for the most part, just something, an area where the dough can stay nice and warm is fine. A dough cutter is what you would cut the dough to portion it. So don't ever tear dough. Use a knife if you have to. Sometimes they're called bench scrapers, and I thought about grabbing one, but to show you, but I didn't think about it until just now. A lame or razor. That's what the two pictures are at the top. The one with the black handle, you'll notice it's just a thin piece of metal. The other one is it holds the straight razor. That's to cut the dough for the scoring. I mentioned the scoring, and you can have really cool designs all over your bread. They're pretty crucial to do that. We go through probably 3 razors a day when we make bread. They dull fairly quickly, and it does need to be razor sharp to cut through the dough versus tearing it. If you tear the dough, you'll rip the ends of the gluten strands, and they'll be tough, and we don't want that. A baking or pizza stone, and then you see in that bottom picture that each deck has one of those. You can buy them a lot of places. When I was younger and poorer, I actually went to a hardware store and got unglazed terracotta tiles and lined my oven with that, and that totally worked. They had to be unglazed, though. The glazing process can be toxic to the bread, so unglazed terracotta tiles will work. And the other thing to notice in the bottom of that picture is a pan in the very bottom. That's the system to create steam. Steam creates lift that also moistens the top of the dough so that as it's rising and baking and doing its thing, it doesn't burn. It gives it that nice caramel gold crusty crust that we love about bread. There's a couple other ways to do that. I've used a squirt gun. So I'll open the door and have a squirt gun. I'll have a pan in the bottom with some heavy duty metal chain, and I'll let that warm up with the oven and then squirt water in there to create lots of steam. There's a couple ways to do it, but that's just some things that I've done. Some books. I always strongly recommend the Flavor Bible and the Vegetarian Flavor Bible just because they're my favorite cookbooks. They're great ways to play with flavors, and I love flavor. That's why we eat, in my opinion. It's not for nutrition. Good grief, no. I just like the flavor. Any bread books by Peter Reinert, The Bread Baker's Apprentice, Artisan Bread Every Day, Whole Grain Breads, The Bread Revolution. Peter Reinert is a James Beard Award-winning baker. Phenomenal breads. You can't go wrong with any one of his books. Tartine Bread is for the restaurant. I think it's in LA. And then the Bread Bible by Rose Levy Berenbaum. She was really helpful for me when I first started out. That was one of the first cookbooks I bought myself, was the Bread Bible. And she kind of dives into some of the science behind it and has some really great formulas in there as well. So hopefully you'll check some of those out at the Chelsea Library. That does it for me. I think I saw some questions pop up. So please, if there are some, let me know. And hopefully you understand a little bit more about how to make bread.
All right, so one of those questions is, what is 00 flour?
So that's 00. The number system is a European numbering system. So we grade ours all-purpose, high gluten, bread flour, cake flour, pastry flour. They actually use the numbering system. And the double flour is a much higher gluten flour. And we use that for our pizza when we do pizzas, which this weekend is pizza weekend. And what they do is they burn the flour, and then they measure the amount of material left. So they'll burn off like the nutrients and stuff, and what's left, and the ash size is the number that they give it, and that's all that is.
And the other question is, what is a recommended proving temperature?
If you've got the capacity to do it in a controlled environment, typically 70 to 75 degrees with about 75 to 85% humidity. So it's fairly humid. Florida would be perfect. But if you can't do the humidity part, I'd go higher on the temperature and go somewhere 75 to 80 degrees, which again, if you think about gas stoves and ovens, that's why it's towards the back. That's where the heat comes from. If you have a gas oven, don't use the pilot. Sometimes I've seen people say to put the dough in the oven and let it warm with the pilot light. That's too hot. Typically, your pilot keeps your oven right around 100 degrees, and that will start to actually cook the dough and not just let it rise. So if you've got no moisture, go 75 to 80 degrees. If you've got some moisture, 70 to 75 degrees.
Let's see, one more. I was told to freeze my yeast. Is this bad?
It's fine as long as it's still in the sealed original container. It absolutely puts the yeast into hibernation. But as soon as you pull it from the freezer, don't refreeze it. You'll have to use it up within about 6 months is the best time frame to do that in. But you don't have to freeze it if you're going to go through it fast enough. We go through it fast enough that we don't do that, but freezing it's fine.
And then is 450 degrees used for all breads?
For us, yes, because we go through the bread so quickly. That also helps create the really firm crust on it. If you've had our multigrain, there's a bit of a nice crust to it, but then it's a nice soft dough, soft bread inside. Same with our Waterloo wheat and our farmhouse. There's a really nice crispy crust to it, but keeps the inside nice and soft. For at home, I wouldn't go higher than 375.
And somebody is asking for the title of the last book you recommended.
The Bread Bible by Rose Levy Berenbaum.
And we are recording this, so we will have access to this if you need to in the future. And you can always give the library a call and we can put these items on hold for you. And I see, looks like one more question right now. You mentioned seeing a bubbling of the yeast. Was this just for starters?
When you're adding it to the liquid, it should bubble and froth considerably. If it's in your starter, the beginning stages, you'll have just the bubbles on top. But as it develops and grows, the bubbles will be throughout. And I strongly recommend that you've got it in a fairly good sized container and that you dig your hand down in there. And when you do that to do the mixing, you'll feel the bubbles. And you should feel the bubbles all the way through. Don't just mix it with a spoon or a spatula. Use your hand. Because again, the bubbles at the beginning stages are just on top and they're fairly small. When you get the bubbles on a more developed starter, they should be larger and all the way through.
Okay, that looks, okay, let's see. Around the holidays, I see fresh yeast in the grocery stores. How best to work with it?
Immediately. Fresh yeast goes bad really quickly. And it does need to stay refrigerated until used. It can be out on the counter for about 10 minutes, but any longer than that, it'll start to do its thing because there's moisture in the air, and it'll start to ferment at that point, and it wouldn't be usable after about 10 minutes on the counter. So use it fairly quickly.
Does it matter how much sponge you use?
Yes, it totally matters because it depends on the bread that you're using it for. Typically, the sponge formula, the bread formula, let's say it's a baguette, for example, it will have the ratio of the sponge for you and then the rest of the ingredients to add to the sponge to make the final batch. So if you're making, let's say, 3 baguette, you'd make the sponge that makes 3 baguette, not a larger sponge to make 12 baguette and only use a part of it for 3. I hope that made sense. But yeah, the sponge should be specific to the formula that you're using for that bread.
Looks like there's a question about kneading. Describe the feel you're looking for, and is it the type of bread you're doing? Is it dependent on that?
It is totally dependent on the type of bread you're making. Think ciabatta versus baguette. Ciabatta, they're on the exact opposite ends, in my opinion, of bread consistency. Baguette being much firmer, crisper, a tighter crumb, whereas ciabatta actually means little pillows. So it's soft, it's aerated, has big, big holes in it. In the amount of kneading you would do for each of those is different. So if you're going for the baguette, you would knead and continue kneading until you got a really firm, elastic structure. But with the ciabatta, you barely knead it at all. You don't knead it. You fold and you mix, and that's really as far as you want to go. So it is dependent on the bread that you're making. If it's brioche, you go even further, so it's really stretchy. If it's pizza dough, you go further because that's got to be really stretchy. What you're looking for basically is a satiny, smooth feel. So you don't want to feel any dry spots. You want to be able to look at it and see that the dough itself is smooth and kind of matte. And I know matte is typically something we think about in terms of a color or like a texture on like the wall. But it shouldn't be shiny. It should be really smooth and satiny. I hope that made sense.
Okay. Well, does anybody have any more questions? I knead in a bowl, not on the counter. Is that an issue?
No, whatever's easiest for you. The bowl will keep it more contained, so you probably don't need to knead as long than on the counter because it's in a smaller space. So the friction in the bowl will help the kneading process along versus on the counter where it can free foam anywhere. So no, as long as it works for you, go for it.
Giving it a couple seconds to see if anyone's typing something, but I think that will be it. Well, all right. I think we can end it there unless anyone has any more questions. Thank you all for showing up this morning. This has been very informative. And thank you all for the questions afterwards. And thank you, Keegan, for the very informative presentation.
My pleasure. And if anyone has questions that they think of later, please don't hesitate to ask me. Shoot me an email or call the bakery. I'm happy to help out. I love doing it. This is great. And I want to really thank the Chelsea Library. I mean, this was a lot of information, and I'm appreciative that they're going to record it and keep it up for us, because bread is it, man. Love it.